All right, so this is a video about the Circle of Knowledge. I guess we'll call it Circle of Knowledge Part 1, where I'm going to explain this infographic that I have. This is a universal system that I've created over time. Roughly 18 years ago is when I started it. And over time, I've improved it into what it is and refined it into what it is today. And I want to explain what it is, how it works, or what do I do with it, and just start with the basics. I think the way I have this picture zoomed out, it's a pretty large picture in one sense, and it probably, some of the words look pretty small at the moment. But I want to start with the zoomed out picture so we can see the pillars and how this thing was built and what is going on. You'll notice a lot of associations and words around the outside that tell you different things about different areas of the circle. So I didn't really plan this. I just figured I'd start talking about it to make some content. Other than I thought, okay, we'll start with the basics, part 1. And that's the pillar words. How did this thing get created and where does it come from? So, and I will zoom in eventually, but if you notice around the outside, you'll see 8 main words: physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, sociology, arts and crafts, or categories, symbology, and language and math. And these are the 8 pillars that everything else you see on the circle is built from that starting point. That you have those 8 words. And the idea was generally that I was looking for topics that kind of encompassed all of human knowledge. I was trying to find, what those topics would be. And I had a starting point from the sciences. There's a natural flow in the sciences between physics, chemistry, and biology. That by natural, I mean it's based on nature, the scale of things. So if you think about physics deals with things that are as small as we can possibly get or define, Planck lengths and stuff, and as big as we get, the whole universe. And it's also a subset of it's very based on engineering and mechanics and the nuts and bolts and how do things work, the hardware, the operating system of, not just the operating system, but the hardware of things, I should say. Okay. But chemistry it's like its own thing. It's a specialty. You could almost think of it as a specialty of physics if you wanted to. But the main difference is it's a different scale. Chemistry doesn't really, deal with anything below the atomic level. Subatomic stuff is reserved for physics. But chemistry is that specific aspect of physical things about how do they interact with each other in a certain scale and on a certain frame and from the atomic up. But it's usually reserved for things that then are, less than room-sized objects. You could have giant vats of chemicals and stuff, but the idea being the chemistry itself is that molecular level. And then you look at biology, and biology is cells, and cells are groups of chemicals, organized in all these different patterns and ways. And so you have this scale going from the smallest stuff in physics or all the way up to the biggest. But then chemistry starts a little bit bigger at the atomic level, and biology starts a little bit bigger at that cellular level. And the fields really feel different too. The physics concentrates on the certain aspect of things, and chemistry has its, like we said, scale, and biology has its scale. And that's how it started. It was mainly just those 3 words. And I felt like they were different sciences, unto themselves, mostly. And it wasn't, and you get those in high school, and it wasn't until I went to college and took a class in psychology. In high school, you kind of get mental health in health class, or something like that. But in college, excuse me, I took some psychology, and the first thing you learn in psychology, at least they did where I was at, was they start you with a model of the body and the brain and the eyes. And they say, how do you take in information? How do your eyes work? How does your brain, manipulate that information and interpret it and perceive it? And how are you conscious, and what is cognizance? And you start getting into, you quickly get into how do your neurons work and, your nervous system. And you realize that neuroscience and neurology is kind of that bridge between biology and psychology. And you're going from those hard sciences of physics, chemistry, and biology into the softer science, more so of like a psychology. And if you could think of it on that scale, the atoms, the physics, the atoms make up the cells, and cells make up the molecules and the compounds, which make up, the biological cells. And that biological cells make up tissues and organs and an organ system and an organism that leads to how that organism operates and how it thinks and how those systems interact with each other, and you get your psychology. So it seemed natural to have physics, chemistry, biology, and psychology. But then it was like, okay, well, psychology doesn't quite just jump back to physics. You think about physics and this and that, but it said, well, it kind of was like, well, what's the natural flow? If we've got these four, or three hard sciences, or one that's kind of a hard or soft science, what's the other side of this thing, or how many things complete the circle? Is there a way to get back to physics, through the scope and scale of these topics? And then you realize, okay, well, one psychology is the basic mental operating system and neurology and, neuroscience of an organism. But what if you have a bunch of those? What's a collective psychology? And you get like mass psychology, and you end up realizing, hey, psychology leads to the social, the sciences of sociology. Things like geography and political science, and how do people operate in groups, and what do they believe, religions, things like that. So, okay, so now we've got 5 things: physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, and sociology. And what is the product of sociology? Well, the product of sociology is arts and crafts. And you could think of either one as a creation. Like you create art and you create things that we create, like blacksmithing and leatherworking and clothes and textiles and machinery. But you have arts and crafts, and the society and the culture that you live in dictates to some level how you express yourself and what art you create and what crafts your society creates, because what you have access to, where your geography is. So the psychological systems, many of them lead to a sociology, and sociology creates arts and craft, either for function or for form, for expression or for something to use. And so now we're almost home. And then you realize that, well, what does art and craft lead to is expression. But the first expressions and the first symbols were like hieroglyphics, or if you didn't really have language yet and you needed to say bird, you'd paint a picture of a bird. Or whatever you were trying to describe, you just paint a picture of it. And how do you express something symbolically? How are you expressing it? Calligraphy, or how do you map something? Making a map. And how do you tell stories and things like that? So the arts and crafts lead to the symbol system and the icon system, and the memes that you use. The way that your society expresses itself is through its symbols. And you find a way to take all that knowledge of your physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, sociology, and your arts and crafts, and you start putting it into an abstracted form of symbols so that you can turn it into information and transport that information to other people, or use it, or write it down, or save it, or in a sense do something like that with it. And so at the core of symbols, though, just the same way like chemistry is just the physics of the elements, you could think of it that way or something. Language and math comes out of symbology, because you can have symbols and icons and memes and all sorts of things that kind of fit into symbology, sound symbols and things like that. Music, starts to get into that, from arts and craft into symbology. But if you just look at the ones that have to do with numbers, the symbols that you use to represent numbers and how do they relate to each other, and the symbols that you use to communicate yourself with spoken sound, and we turn those into words. So you have your number symbols and your word symbols. That's language and math. And so symbolism and symbology leads to language and math that your society uses, or that the culture will develop. And lastly, it comes full circle, because it's language and math. What is physics really? So you have applied physics, and the actual doing of physics is more like the engineering and, carrying out the building and doing what the physics says you can do scientifically. But the subject of physics, or the study of physics, or the quote unquote the physics itself, is just the we use all our language and math to create, basically word problems that say you have an object going this fast and it hits an object going that speed, and what do they do at this angle? And then you take those words and the numbers involved and you do a bunch of math and you are modeling the external reality, the real world, with this model that you created out of language and math. So physics on that hand, not the applied side, but physics is the model. Physics is the model of language and math that you use to study all of the universe from the smallest thing to the biggest thing. And so you've come full circle now. And, you could think of physics, chemistry, and biology as the hard sciences. Sociology, the arts and crafts, and symbolism as the soft science. And the one at the top and bottom, psychology and language and math, they're kind of half and half. Psychology is kind of like a hard science, kind of like a soft science. It's got aspects of both. And same with language and math itself. It's not really a science, it's just language and math. But we think of that as, maybe left brain, right brain, or like the expressive side and the analytical side. Language being more expressive and math being more analytical. And so this is like where, I'm going to check my time. I wanted to keep these at 10 or 15 or 20 minutes apiece and do however many I need or want and just kind of keep talking. So I'm at 11 or 12 minutes. I'll go a little bit longer here because, again, I'm doing this off the cuff and I didn't really have a plan yet. I'll zoom in a bit and we'll start with that. So this is where the circle begins with. Before we get into all the other words and stuff that you see or the colors or what's going on, part one of this is just to say, what are the 8 pillars? Physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, sociology, arts and crafts, symbology, language and math. Why are they the pillars? Where did they come from? And to show how they lead from one to the other kind of on scale. From physics, from the smallest to the biggest, but then up bigger to an organism, bigger to many organisms. And then you're kind of just becoming holistic, or what does that society create? How do you extract that back out now into like a quintessence or back into a symbol? And now you're back to like language and math isn't really any size. It's like, it's not even small or big. It's just no size. It's an abstraction of communication or how to speak or what do these numbers mean or something else like that. So, and over the years, I never came up with another name for this thing. I've always just called it the circle of knowledge because it's a circle and it's about knowledge. And I started with those categories about 18 years ago. And I think at one point I had called the arts and crafts like trades and something else. But after the first few years, it settled into what the 8 pillars haven't really changed in most of that 18 years. And I have saved all my iterations over the years, and I have them all logged online and in different places. So maybe after at some point, if I make enough of these, I'll pull up some of the old ones just to show the differences. But I'm starting with the most current version that I have. And so then my question was, okay, so I'm creating this universal system, and I want it to encompass all of human knowledge and all of human academia, or what do we know and what do we think, and something like that. And I wondered if this was going to be the right spread of things to really encompass everything. And I was like, well, what about other topics that aren't so, where does dance go, or where does love go? You just start thinking of other words, and you're like, well, what does that fit under? But before we can get to all that, we had to build it from the ground up. Or I'm using the formal we. I had to build it from the ground up. And start with that premise that I said, well, you've just got this system of 8 words. Now, where does that lead? So what's the next logical step? And I'll probably just ramble on here for a second and then make a part 2, because this is a good length between 10 and 15 minutes or whatever, for what is the next step. And maybe we can start to get into that a little bit. So, well, the obvious thing that came to mind after I had my first kind of pillar words, because I was already in that mode of physics, chemistry, biology, and thinking of the sciences, there's certain things in science that come right up, like biophysics or biochemistry, and how do you get them? And I thought to myself, well, obviously, let me not think about all these things and where do they go. Let me just cross each word with its neighbor and see what would go in that area. And I'll lead into it a little bit here, but then I think I'm going to leave that for part 2, and we'll start talking about some of the first level abstractions that you get. So maybe I won't even zoom in too much on this one until the next video, but just to show you that you can zoom in and these words become a lot more, clearer clearer and you can read them and stuff. And we'll get into what and why. But for example, over here, the obvious thing is, okay, if I have physics and I put it on a circle, and I thought the circle because I noticed that pattern of where you kind of one leads to the other through natural science and through the social sciences, you can kind of create this loop back around like I described. So then I said, okay, well, if I just ate things and I split them up evenly, and at first, I guess I should say too, the orientation of the circle has rotated a bit. Sometimes the language of math might have been over here or this and that, and we can eventually see the old ones. But at some point, I really settled into this position, and it hasn't changed in years for the outside orientation after I really became familiar with this own thing that I created. But in any case, the beginning steps after the 8 pillars, and you understand that these are the 8 pillar topics of human knowledge as we're labeling them. I said, well, okay, if physics is here and chemistry is here, and I just split them up evenly, around the circle in 8s. Well, halfway between them somewhere would be physical chemistry. And I didn't want to put it on the outside of the circle because that would be like a pillar word. And we don't want, I could just populate it that way and have these outside edge fill in and get, fuller and fuller. But I thought graphically it would be easier to use the next tier in. And I guess I should also say, I said, well, if I have these 8 topics, what kind of system does that create? And I thought the easiest way here would just be to connect them all and make each connection from one to the other 7. And you can see that, or the outsides count as, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But each one connects to each other. And then I thought, well, that's plenty of things for me to mess around with and populate and try to make sense of it all over time. I said, let's just start with the 8 crisscrosses. But the first obvious ones were these outside ones. So here you see physics and chemistry makes physical chemistry. So I put that in that area, and I said, well, it has to be there. I forced it on myself. And same thing with here is chemistry and biology. You'll see biochemistry sits at the intersection of chemistry and biology. So I'll stop there. This is a video and an introduction to the circle of knowledge. Excuse me. And the 8 pillar words around the outside. And if I was to have to explain this to somebody and they want to learn it in detail, that's how you begin understanding what happened here and how this all came about. And if you're interested, you can leave comments or whatnot and or watch the next part, which it looks like it's. And I'm just doing these on the fly, but it looks like the next part I'll zoom in a bit and start talking about these 8 intersections, and we'll just see where it goes from there. And I'll do another 10 or 15 or 20 minutes and see where that leads to talking about some of this other stuff around the outside. And then maybe how you use this and other things I've built with it and what I'm trying to do with it. But for now, I hope you enjoyed. That's the circle of knowledge. And we'll leave it at that. Okay, have a great day.